The mini-boss is supposed to be a thing that is less difficult than the real boss, right? That's not always how it goes. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on GameRank, 10 mini-bosses stronger than the hardest bosses in video games. Starting off at number 10, the malformed Triceratops in Returnal. Otherwise known as the Run Ender, these frustrating mini-bosses only show up in the 6th and final biome of Returnal, and they're no joke. They take a ton of punishment, they have some hard-to-avoid ranged attacks, and their close-range moves are incredibly fast, and the timing is difficult to predict, to say the least. On top of that, their attacks cause suit malfunctions, and that can be debilitating depending on the effect. These guys are so infamous that a lot of players consider them to be harder than the last boss, or really any boss in Returnal. It's not just that they're difficult either, like they are, obviously, but it's also the fact that if you do manage to kill them, you might have taken so much damage that you don't really have hope of recovering from it. Like, this is at least partially a roguelike after all, so a bad turn at this point can be disastrous. These things can be a perfect example of a tough mini-boss. They're not quite as elaborate or complex as one of the actual bosses, but they're tough enough to be a problem, and the damage they can dish out makes them possibly the most dangerous things you encounter in the game. And number 9 is the Chainsaw Sisters from Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 4 doesn't really have any traditional mini-bosses, but the Chainsaw Ganados fit pretty perfectly into that role as enemy encounters that are rare and nonetheless incredibly dangerous. For me, the worst encounter is the one against the dreaded Chainsaw Sisters, who you see when you take the left path in Chapter 2, Part 3. Even after playing through the game multiple times, this part makes the hairs on my arms stand up. Like, it's itchy, let's just say. There's not a lot to like going on here. For one, Ashley's with you, and if she takes any damage, it's basically game over. The area is small and cramped as well, which is about the worst possible place to get ambushed by two psychos with chainsaws, you know? Remember, just one hit from these enemies means instant death. All they have to do is get close enough to you, and you're dead, and there's two of them. Like all other chainsaw enemies in the game, they have a ton of health, and it takes a lot to get one to even flinch. So, just to make them even worse, the Chainsaw Sisters swing their saws much faster than a standard chainsaw man. Most of the bosses in Resident Evil 4 don't give me a lot of trouble anymore, but these guys are still scary to me, if only because of how easily they can kill you. At number 8 is Saturn from Borderlands 2. Anybody remember this? It appears near the end of the game at the Hyperion Information Stockade, you know? When you go back to Firestone, unlike pretty much every other boss in the game, this guy doesn't have a health bar, it just kind of shows up. That doesn't make him easier to deal with, obviously. This thing is just a wall of guns and rockets that'll whittle down your health in seconds. But of course, also has a boatload of HP itself. Just trying to fight it can be awkward because of all the slag pools around. Step in that, and obviously the damage you take is going to be elemental, and then it gets way worse. In comparison, the final boss is actually kind of a pushover. Depending on your build, this guy isn't the toughest thing ever, but as far as mini-bosses go, he's pretty beefy, and up there with some of the toughest standard bosses in the game, for sure. I mean, you can end up playing Borderlands 2 and not really messing with something this tough for a long period of time. This includes a lot of standard bosses. And number 7 is Goro from Mortal Kombat. This guy is basically the ultimate mini-boss, right? Go back to the original Mortal Kombat. You fight him before the actual final battle with Shang Tsung, and even though he's the penultimate fight, he's clearly the tougher opponent. Like, there was a period of time, I think, after beating Mortal Kombat, where I forgot about Shang Tsung. Goro just really felt like the real fight, you know? But what makes him tough is how cheap he can be. He's got the highest attack in defense of any fighter. He's got this stupid stomp attack. Also, his throw is ridiculous as well. It does like half your health bar in one grab. Like, it's super unfair. Shang Tsung isn't exactly a cakewalk or anything, but compared to Goro, I mean, you can understand why, as a kid, I didn't really remember him for a while, right? And number 6 is the Great Sensei from God Hand. Ask anyone who's played God Hand all the way through what they think the toughest boss is. They'll probably give you this as an answer. Actually, there's a ton of bosses in the game, and a lot of them are really hard, but in my mind, there's just no other bosses as hard and also technically as inconsequential as this fight. He just comes out of nowhere as the boss of Stage 7-3. He's not like a recurring villain or one of the main 4 bad guys. He's just some guy called the Great Sensei, and now you gotta fight him. Immediately, you're probably seeing the problem with this guy. Here's a game where you fight everything with your fists, and he's got a katana, a sword, a blade, a thing that gives him crazy range from the start of the fight, and a lot of extra damaging attacks for somebody who's fighting with their hands. It'd be bad enough if you had to take him one-on-one, but just to really make you mad, he generates a bunch of shadow clones of himself to attack you too. These guys aren't just tricks either, they're full-blown enemies that sure don't take a lot of damage, but they do hit as hard as the real guy. For a guy who's technically just a mini-boss, the Great Sensei really does not mess around. And number 5 is Thunder Slimer from Mega Man X, an absolute classic of the run-and-gun genre, but not perfect. I don't mean to say like there's anything that's like ridiculously like game-breaking or not fun, but there is a pain in the ass called the Thunder Slimer, otherwise known as the dumb blob boss from Spark Mandrill stage. These games are no stranger to some annoying mini-bosses, but this guy's probably one of the worst. Unless you know the trick to killing it, he's also one of the toughest. That's what's so annoying about it. For one thing, he takes up a ton of space, and a huge part of what makes this fight so tough is if he touches you, there goes a quarter of your health. It shoots lightning, it can be hard to hit, and just to make things extra annoying, it leaves these water puddles on the ground that trap you in place a few seconds, and that is, I mean, beyond infuriating when it happens. Especially when you don't know it's coming. Like, I remember the first time I played the game and got to this guy, I was just like, you're kidding me. Stop. Now, if you have the tornado power, this thing is much easier, but if you don't, and I very specifically didn't the first time I encountered him, if you don't have that, it's not fun. It's just really, really tedious, difficult, and frustrating. Definitely a more difficult fight than Spark Mandrill. And number 4 is Slogra from Super Castlevania 4, another 90s classic. Castlevania 4 is considered one of the easiest Castlevania games, actually, and it is, at least up until you get to the roadblock, that is the Castle Keep. Even though he's the first mini-boss level, he is infuriatingly hard. Just getting to this guy can be torture, and you have to get through a large section of an already difficult stage just to see him. The worst part, by far, is this flying block section, where falling down, even if it's into a part where you were just standing on, is instant death. His attack pattern's fairly basic, actually, and that's what makes him so frustrating. When you hit him, he jumps into the air and tries to land on top of you. It's easy enough to avoid once you know how to do it, but the annoying thing is that he sometimes follows it up with this lunge, and good luck attempting to anticipate that and dodge it when he does that, because it is not an easy prospect. To make matters worse, he has a massive hitbox, so even when it seems like you're going to avoid his attack, he still hits you. Like, the final fight against Dracula is pretty easy, actually, but this guy messes you up every time. And number 3 is Dark Link from Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. There's a lot of sub-bosses in Zelda games that are tougher than the actual bosses, but this guy is probably the most obvious choice. I mean, it's Dark Link, the final boss from Zelda 2, but for whatever reason, you're fighting it halfway through the Water Temple of all places. Like in the NES game, Dark Link has all of your moves, and he's not afraid to put up a fight. He attacks aggressively and can counter most of your moves, on top of being able to turn translucent and teleport. There's a few ways to make him easier, but on your first go-around, he's probably going to mess you up. In terms of difficulty, Dark Link isn't the hardest boss on this list by a long shot, but he's definitely one of the most challenging encounters in Ocarina of Time, and is considered by many to be the hardest fight in the game. And number 2 is the Twin Shark Giants in Bloodborne. Plenty of tough enemy encounters in From Software games, but rarely are they more difficult than the boss fights. But that's not the case with these guys. Even though the bosses of the DLC to Bloodborne are considered the most difficult in the game, they still aren't as absolutely deadly as the 2 random shark giants hiding out in the well of the fishing village. Pretty much everything is working against you here, too. The area is tiny, enemies are huge, they love to go absolutely nuts, and oh yeah, there's 2 of them. There's hardly enough room down here to deal with even one of them, but 2 it's straight up chaos. There's a reason so many guides just say to run down here, get the items and run away, because trying to fight these things is just not worth it. For someone who's played through the game multiple times at this point, most bosses in Bloodborne don't scare me like they used to, but every time I try to take on the shark giants down in this well, I just end up getting annihilated. Now, there are some strategies that make the encounter easier, of course, but unless you've got the right build or the patience for it, it's just not worth dealing with. And finally at number 1 is the Boost Guardian and the Spider Guardian from Metroid Prime 2. They don't get any worse than these two. Metroid Prime 2 is already a much more difficult game than its predecessor, but with these two fights, they really went overboard. Out of the many bosses and mini-bosses in the Metroid Prime series, these are by far the worst, but for different reasons. The Boost Guardian is just a total pain. You have to fight in the Dark World, so you're just constantly taking damage, and it has this annoying attack where it rolls around the arena and just can't do anything about it. So you have to sit there and watch your health slowly drain away, and when it does hit you, it hits like a truck. The boss was so tough with this one that it was actually one of the few things that they ended up tweaking for the Metroid Prime collection. It's a lot more manageable compared to the original GameCube version. The Spider Guardian sucks too, but for different reasons. Instead of being tough, this thing's just incredibly annoying. You have to fight it in ball form, and the whole thing revolves around opening gates to get it to run into these electric things, I guess. It's awkward, it's frustrating, and worst of all, it's boring and takes forever. There's no worse combination than difficult and boring, but they managed it with the Spider Guardian. The actual bosses in here are nothing compared to these two, and they're infamous for a reason. That's all for today. Leave us a comment. Let us know what you think. If you like this video, click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week. Best way to see them first is, of course, the subscriptions, so click subscribe. Don't forget to enable notifications, and as always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter, Falcon the Hero. We'll see you next time right here on Game Ranks.